Someone spends $40,000 turning a 1970 Chevelle into something it was never supposed to be. New suspension, fuel-injected engine, air conditioning that actually works, Bluetooth hidden inside the original dashboard. The body is original. The soul, they will tell you, is preserved, but the guts had been replaced entirely. And they will defend every single modification with the conviction of someone protecting something sacred. That behavior does not make sense on the surface. If the car matters, why change it? If the changes matter, why keep the shell? The answer lives somewhere most people never think to look. To understand the person standing in that garage, you have to go back to a specific kind of American childhood, not a generic one, a very particular one, shaped by a moment in history when the car was not transportation. It was the primary symbol of everything a man was supposed to become. In the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the American suburb was still a relatively new experiment. Families had moved outward from cities into neighborhoods built around the automobile. The garage was not a storage room, it was a room with status. What sat inside it communicated your position, your ambition, your discipline. A boy growing up in that environment did not just see cars, he absorbed them as a language before he could fully read. The specific cars that dominated that language were not luxury vehicles, they were muscle cars. The Pontiac GTO, the Plymouth Roadrunner, the Ford Torino. These were not subtle machines, they were loud, oversized, and deliberately aggressive. They arrived at exactly the moment when American culture was fracturing, the Vietnam War dividing families, the civil rights movement challenging every assumption about who the country was built for, and a generation of fathers returning from war without the emotional vocabulary to process what they had seen. In that tension, the muscle car became a container for a feeling that had no other outlet. Power you could control, speed you could measure, an identity you could earn with your hands. A boy in 1971 who watched his father restore a Dodge Charger in the driveway on Saturday afternoons was receiving a very specific transmission. The work was silent, but the message was dense. Men fix things, men improve things, men make something broken into something worthy of admiration. That belief did not get examined, it became embedded. Then something happened that shattered the whole framework. The 1973 oil embargo. Gas prices that made those beautiful, thirsty engines suddenly feel irresponsible. Then the 1979 energy crisis confirmed it. The American muscle car did not gradually decline, it collapsed. Within a few years, the cars being manufactured were smaller, slower, and built with a kind of apology in their design. The Chevrolet Chevette, the Ford Pinto, vehicles that communicated scarcity instead of abundance. For a young man who had structured his sense of future identity around that earlier automotive language, this was not just a market shift. It registered psychologically as a withdrawal of permission. The thing he had been told to want, trained to want, suddenly declared obsolete. And because that want was tied to identity rather than preference, the loss had no clean resolution. This is where the psychology of modernization begins, and it is more precise than nostalgia. Nostalgia is passive. It aches for the past without reaching toward it. What restomods represent is something more active and more complicated. It is a renegotiation. The person building a restomod is not trying to return to 1970. They know that is impossible. They are trying to take what was emotionally unfinished in 1970 and complete it on their own terms, using everything they now have access to. The modern fuel injection system going into a 1969 Camaro is not a betrayal of the original car, it is a correction. It says the dream was right, but the execution was limited. With 40 years of technological advancement, the version that should have existed can now finally exist. The fantasy can be made real, and made functional, and made sustainable. The emotional logic is completely coherent once you understand what the car actually represents. What most people misunderstand is that they assume this is about the car. They watch the hours in the garage, and they assume the person loves machines. Some do, but the machines are almost always a proxy. What the person loves is a version of themselves that they glimpsed briefly and then lost. A version that felt capable, respected, and legible in a culture that rewarded those specific qualities. The car is the most tangible object connected to that version. There is also something important about the way this specific generation experienced control, or the lack of it. Coming of age in the 1970s meant absorbing a continuous series of institutional failures. Watergate dismantled trust in leadership. The end of Vietnam was not triumphant. The manufacturing towns that had employed fathers and grandfathers began to hollow out. Inflation eroded the middle-class promise that had been made explicitly in the previous decade. These were not abstract economic conditions. They were felt in households, in job losses, in the quiet anxiety of parents who no longer knew what to promise their children. A person who grew up inside that anxiety, who watched the adult world prove itself unreliable, does not always emerge with a passive relationship to the future. Sometimes they emerge with an intense need to build something that holds, something that does not break when external conditions change. The restomod project satisfies that need with unusual precision. It is a controlled environment. The problems are finite, the solutions exist, the outcome, with enough patience and money and skill, is guaranteed. That guarantee is not trivial for someone who spent their formative years in a world that repeatedly failed to deliver on its promises. Look at the language these enthusiasts use, and the psychological pattern becomes even clearer. They do not say the car is pretty, they say it is right. They do not say the engine is powerful, they say it performs the way it was always supposed to. Correctness, completion, these are the words of someone resolving something unfinished, not someone simply enjoying a hobby. The social dimension adds another layer. Classic car shows and restomod gatherings are not primarily about competition, though competition exists. They function as spaces where a particular kind of masculine competence is still recognized and celebrated without ambiguity. In a cultural moment where many of the traditional markers of male identity have been renegotiated, often necessarily, often rightfully, these spaces offer something that has become rare. Clear criteria, visible skill, legible achievement. The car either runs or it does not. The craftsmanship either shows or it does not. There is no committee to decide whether the work counts. This does not mean the culture is frozen or resistant to change. The restomod community is built on change. Modern brakes on a vintage body, contemporary electronics behind a 1968 dashboard. The philosophy is not preservation for its own sake, it is integration. Take the best of what was and combine it with the best of what is. That is a sophisticated psychological position, even when the person holding it could not articulate it in those terms. And here's where the reframing becomes necessary. These men are regularly misread as people who cannot let go of the past, who are stuck, who are compensating for something. That reading is too simple, and it misses the actual structure of what is happening. They are not refusing to move forward. They are refusing to accept that moving forward requires abandoning everything that came before. They are insisting, with every modification and every restored panel and every upgraded component, that continuity is possible, that something can be both old and vital, that a thing can carry history and still perform in the present. The garage at 2 in the morning, the smell of metal and engine oil, the careful work on something most people would have junked decades ago, none of that is escape. It is an argument, a slow, expensive, meticulous argument made with tools instead of words. The argument is that what was built before still has value, that what was lost can be recovered, that the version of yourself you glimpsed at 17, standing next to something powerful and loud and entirely American, was not wrong to want what it wanted. The car is not the project. The self is the project. The car is just the clearest way they found to work on it.